If you've ever visited the ruins of monumental ancient architecture, say you're walking up to one of those grand ancient Near Eastern facades, you know the exact feeling.
Oh, sure. The sheer scale of it.
Right. You see these massive limestone pillars, these towering edifices that look like they were literally built to hold up the sky itself. And there's this immediate, visceral expectation of structural integrity.
Yeah, your brain just registers the size and assumes permanence.
Exactly. It projects absolute strength, it projects kingship. But then you walk through those heavy stone doors expecting to find an interior that matches that majesty, and you find that the inside has been completely gutted.
It's like a hollow shell.
Right. The structure is an illusion. There's nothing actually supporting that magnificent facade. And you realize that, well, when the winds of history blow hard enough against it, the whole thing is destined to collapse.
Which is the perfect metaphor for what we're looking at today.
It really is. Welcome to this deep dive. Today we are looking at one of the most famous figures in biblical history, and that is King Saul.
Yeah, a man who looked like a fortress on the outside, but who hollowed out entirely on the inside.
Exactly. So we're going to deconstruct the chaotic, contradictory, and honestly brilliant text of 1 Samuel chapters 8 through 16 to find out exactly how a kingdom and a man falls apart from the inside out.
It's quite a ride.
It is. And because I know you, our listener, are coming to this with a serious background in biblical scholarship and a deep investment in these texts, we're skipping all the basic introductory stuff. We're moving at a graduate seminar pace to really explore the editorial wars happening beneath the surface here.
No training meals today.
None at all. So to map out exactly where we are going, here is the specific agenda for today's deep dive. First, we will cover the narrative summary of 1 Samuel 8 through 16, just laying out the raw story.
Just the drama.
Right. Second, we'll move into the scholarly framing, looking at the history of how this text was actually compiled. Third, we will get into our chapter-by-chapter analysis and source criticism. Fourth, we'll cover exegetical and theological debates.
That's where it gets really thorny.
Oh, absolutely. Then fifth, we will explore literary and character analysis. Sixth, we're going to look at rabbinic and Christian interpretive traditions. And finally, we'll conclude with an LDS devotional reading of the text. So that is the roadmap.
Sounds like a full plate.
It is. I want to start by just handing it over to you to give us the raw story. Let's hold off on all the source criticism for a minute. Just tell us the drama of these chapters, because before we can pull it apart, we have to feel the sheer weight of what's at stake.
Yeah, and it really is a devastating narrative arc. I mean, the story of 1 Samuel 8 through 16 is, at its core, the tragedy of a covenant people who decide they just can't bear the immense vulnerability of being unique anymore.
They just want to be normal.
Exactly. They demand to be normal. For generations, Israel has been operating under this loose, decentralized, tribal confederation, right? They're led by these charismatic judges who only rise up when there's an immediate military threat.
Which is a terrifying way to run a country.
Oh, completely. It's intentionally fragile. It's designed by its very nature to reinforce the theological reality that Yahweh is their true and only king.
Right.
But Samuel, who was the great prophet and the last of these judges, he's grown old. And he installs his two sons, Joel and Abijah, to serve as judges down in Beersheba. And they are deeply, deeply corrupt.
Classic nepotism problem.
Yeah. The text tells us they don't walk in his ways. They turn aside after lucre. They take bribes. They pervert justice. So the elders of Israel get together, they confront Samuel at Ramah, and they issue a demand that changes the entire course of biblical history. They say, make us a king to judge us like all the nations.
Man, that phrase, like all the nations, it's just the nice twisting in the covenant, isn't it?
It is the ultimate indictment of their own identity. I mean, Israel's entire existential premise, going all the way back to Sinai, is to be set apart, to be a holy nation. So Samuel is personally devastated by this. He feels totally rejected.
Which is understandable.
Right. But Yahweh speaks to Samuel and completely reframes the crisis. God says, hearken unto the voice of the people, for they have not rejected thee, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them.
So the narrative lays down its theological verdict at the very moment the monarchy is conceived. It's an act of treason.
Absolute treason. Yet in this shocking move, Yahweh tells Samuel to actually concede to their demand, but he has to warn them first. So Samuel delivers this chilling, prophetic warning known as the Mishpat Hamelech, the manner or the law of the king.
And it is not a pretty picture.
No, it's not. He outlines this predatory extractive institution. He says the king will confiscate their sons for his armies, their daughters for his kitchens. He'll take the best of their fields and vineyards for his courtiers and heavily tax their flocks.
Basically a giant warning label on the monarchy.
Exactly. And he warns them that one day they will cry out because of this king and Yahweh will not hear them. But the people listen to this devastating prophecy. They look at the encroaching Philistine armies and they essentially say, we don't care.
We still want a king so he can go out before us and fight our battles.
Right. They want the visible monument, even if it crushes them.
So the search begins, and they get Saul.
Yeah. And the narrative shifts into this almost folkloric, deeply ironic quest. We're introduced to Saul, a young man from the tribe of Benjamin. And the text goes out of its way to tell us he is remarkably handsome and that from his shoulders upward, he's taller than any of the people.
He is the physical embodiment of that monumental architecture we talked about.
He really is. So he's out looking for his father, Kish's lost donkeys. He wanders through the hill country for days, completely unsuccessful, until his servant suggests they seek out a local seer for help.
And that seer just happens to be Samuel.
Just happens to be. And Yahweh has already whispered in Samuel's ear that the man from Benjamin is coming. So Samuel treats this confused young man with intense, almost shocking honor. He gives him the prime portion at a feast. And the next morning, Samuel takes a flask of oil, pours it over Saul's head, kisses him, and privately anoints him.
And he declares that Yahweh has made him captain or Nagid over his inheritance. But that private anointing has to be made public, right?
Right, which leads us to the gathering at Mizpah. Samuel calls all the tribes together to cast lots to publicly select the king. The lot falls to Benjamin, then the family of Matri, and finally to Saul. But when they go to look for him, he's missing.
Which is so embarrassing for everyone involved.
Oh, completely. They literally have to ask Yahweh if the man has even arisen. And the divine response is just dripping with irony. God says, behold, he hath hid himself among the stuff or among the baggage.
So they run and pull this giant of a man out of the luggage.
Yes. And when he stands up, his sheer physical stature is undeniable. He's head and shoulders above everyone. The people are absolutely mesmerized by the aesthetic, and they shout, God save the king.
And shortly after, in chapter 11, we see the zenith of his early reign, right? The Ammonite threat.
Right. The Ammonites threaten Jabesh Gilead with a brutal ultimatum. The Spirit of God rushes upon Saul. He hacks a yoke of oxen to pieces, sends them throughout the tribes, musters a massive army, and utterly routs the Ammonites. He proves himself as a charismatic, effective military savior. The people are thrilled. The system seems to be working perfectly.
But that is the meteoric rise, and it is entirely external, because as soon as the pressure really mounts, we hit the fall. And the fall happens so fast.
It does. The cracks appear just 2 chapters later, in chapter 13, at Gilgal. The honeymoon is over. The Philistines are massing this technologically superior, massive military force. The Israelite army is terrified. Men are hiding in caves and thickets and rocks and fleeing across the Jordan River.
It's a total meltdown. And Samuel had previously commanded Saul to wait 7 days at Gilgal for him to arrive and offer the burnt offerings before battle.
And Saul waits. But as that 7th day starts slipping away and his army is literally disintegrating before his eyes, the pressure breaks him. He demands the burnt offering be brought to him, and he offers the sacrifice himself.
And of course, as soon as he finishes, Samuel arrives.
Classic timing. Samuel demands to know what he's done, and Saul offers all these pragmatic, desperate excuses. But Samuel cuts through it all and issues the first devastating rejection. He says Saul acted foolishly. His kingdom will not continue. Yahweh has already sought out a man after his own heart.
Man, and if Gilgal was the fracture, chapter 15 is the complete collapse, the Amalekite episode.
It is the absolute catastrophe of Saul's reign. Samuel comes to Saul with the harem command, the divine, terrifying order to wage holy war against the Amalekites. They are to be totally destroyed. Man, woman, infant, livestock.
It's retribution for Amalek attacking Israel centuries earlier in the wilderness.
Right. So Saul musters the army, goes to the city of Amalek, and is entirely victorious. But he disobeys. He spares Agag, the Amalekite king, and he spares the best of the sheep, the ox, and all the good stuff. He only destroys what is vile and refuse.
And then Samuel comes to meet him.
And Saul cheerfully declares, Blessed be thou of the Lord. I have performed the commandment of the Lord.
Such a painfully oblivious greeting.
It really is. And Samuel replies with probably the most damning question in the narrative. What meaneth then this bleating of the sheep in mine ears and the lowing of the oxen which I hear?
Busted.
Completely. Saul instantly shifts the blame to the people. claiming they saved the best to sacrifice to Yahweh. Samuel stops him and delivers that iconic oracle. Hath the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice.
For rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry. It's so heavy.
It is. Samuel pronounces the final, absolute rejection of Saul's kingship.
And the physical confrontation that follows is just unforgettable.
As Samuel turns to leave, Saul reaches out in desperation and grabs the hem of the prophet's robe, and the fabric tears. Samuel stops, looks at the torn cloth, and weaponizes the moment. He says, "The Lord hath rent the kingdom of Israel from thee this day, and hath given it to a neighbor of thine that is better than thou." Then Samuel demands Agag be brought to him. Agag approaches, hoping the bitterness of death is past. But Samuel personally hews Agag in pieces before the Lord. Then Samuel leaves, and the text notes he never came to see Saul again until the day of his death. But he still mourned for him.
Which clears the stage for the replacement in chapter 16. The hollow monument is still standing, but the power has been completely transferred.
Yes. Yahweh interrupts Samuel's mourning and sends him on this covert, highly dangerous mission. He has to take a horn of oil to Bethlehem, to the house of Jesse, to anoint the new king. Samuel is terrified Saul will hear of it and kill him.
Paranoia is setting in.
God provides a cover story of a local sacrifice. Samuel arrives, asks Jesse to pass his sons before him. The oldest, Eliab, steps forward. He's tall, impressive, looks exactly like a king. Samuel thinks, surely this is the guy.
But Yahweh delivers the profound corrective.
Right. Look not on his countenance or on the height of his stature, because I have refused him. For man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looketh on the heart. 7 sons passed by, all rejected. Jesse finally admits there's the youngest, keeping the sheep. They send for him.
And David is brought in.
David arrives. Ruddy, beautiful eyes, handsome. Yahweh says, "Arise, anoint him." Samuel anoints the boy. And the text concludes with this terrifying exchange of spiritual power. The Spirit of Yahweh rushes upon David. In that exact same moment, the Spirit departs from Saul, and an evil spirit from Yahweh descends upon the king, terrorizing him.
Wow. When you hear the story told seamlessly like that, I mean, it sounds like a single brilliant author sat down and wrote a tragedy from beginning to end. But when you actually start reading the Hebrew text, especially in chapters 8 through 10, the text contradicts itself constantly.
It's a mess if you read it closely.
It is. Why does the narrative fiercely condemn the monarchy on one page, calling it apostasy, and then call Saul a divine gift to save the people on the next page? So we are moving into our scholarly framing now, because we really have to understand the editorial wars happening beneath the surface of the text. And that starts with understanding Martin Noth's framework.
Right. To understand the tension here, you have to look at the paradigm Martin Noth proposed in 1943. It completely redefined biblical scholarship. Noth argued that the books of Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings aren't just loosely connected historical scrolls.
They're a unified project.
Exactly. He argued they represent a single massive narrative compiled by a highly coherent theological school, which he called the Deuteronomist, or DTR, and the crucial element of Noth's thesis is the dating. He argued this monumental editorial work was finalized during the Babylonian exile around the mid-6th century BCE.
So if you're the listener, imagine the psychological state of this editor. Jerusalem has been burned to the ground. The Temple of Solomon is a pile of rubble. The Davidic king has been blinded and dragged off in chains to Babylon.
It's absolute trauma.
Right. Standing in the ashes of an entirely destroyed nation, the Deuteronomist is looking back through the archives, trying to answer the single most agonizing question in Israelite history. Why did Yahweh let this happen to us?
That's the exact context. And from that exilic perspective, the Deuteronomist shapes disparate ancient sources into a cohesive theological argument. And the argument is brutal. Covenant faithfulness produces divine blessing, but covenant violation inevitably produces national catastrophe. The destruction of Jerusalem wasn't because Yahweh was weaker than the Babylonian gods. It was because Israel and her kings fundamentally broke the covenant.
Which explains so much about chapter 8. I mean, if you are an editor writing after the monarchy has literally resulted in the destruction of your nation, of course you're going to frame the founding of that monarchy as a catastrophic apostasy. You look at the rubble and say, we never should have asked for a king in the first place.
It perfectly explains the intense hostility in those passages. But Noth's theory, while foundational, didn't account for everything. There are massive sections of Samuel and Kings that are incredibly optimistic about the monarchy.
Which doesn't fit the exilic doom and gloom vibe.
Not at all. So in 1973, Frank Moore Cross published Canaanite Myth and Hebrew Epic, where he introduced a vital revision to Noth's theory. Cross argued for a double redaction. He proposed that there wasn't just one exilic editor, but actually two major editions of this history.
Walk us through the difference between the two editions, because this feels like the key that unlocks the contradictions in the Saul narrative.
So Cross proposed that the first edition, which he called DTR-1, was composed earlier, before the exile, during the reign of King Josiah in the late 7th century BCE. Josiah was a righteous king who instituted massive reforms. So the DTR-1 layer is highly optimistic. It's pro-Davidic. It celebrates the monarchy as a vehicle for God's purposes.
But then Josiah dies.
Tragically killed in battle. And a few decades later, the nation is destroyed. So during the exile, a second editor, DTR-2, takes that optimistic scroll and updates it. DTR-2 is the voice of profound despair. This editor is deeply anti-monarchic and adds layers of text to explain why even Josiah's righteousness couldn't save them.
Let me make sure I'm grasping the implications of this for our reading of Saul. If Cross is right about DTR-1 and DTR-2, does that mean when we read 1 Samuel, we're essentially reading two different constitutional eras fighting for dominance on the exact same page? Are the editors at war with each other?
That is a phenomenal way to put it. Yes, we are reading a theological debate spanning generations. When you see the glowing, miraculous rise of Saul in chapter 9, where God lovingly provides a king to save the people, you're hearing the echoes of older historical sources preserved by the optimistic DTR-1 layer.
Right.
But when the narrative abruptly grinds to a halt in chapter 8 for a theological treatise on how a king will enslave everyone, or when Samuel condemns the entire enterprise in chapter 12, you're hearing the DTR-2 exilic editor asserting control over the narrative.
Reminding the reader that the whole project was doomed from the start.
Exactly.
We also have to ground this in historical reality, right?
Yeah.
We're doing source criticism, but these editors aren't just inventing stories out of thin air. They are working with historical memories of the late Bronze to early Iron Age transition. And pragmatically speaking, Israel absolutely needed centralization to survive the Philistine threat.
The archaeological context is vital here. We know from the historical record that the Sea Peoples, which included the Philistines, settled on the coastal plain. They possessed ironworking technology, centralized city-states, and a highly organized military structure. The Israelites up in the hill country were just a decentralized militia. They simply could not withstand the sustained military pressure.
So the Israelites' request for a king to go out before us and fight our battles wasn't just some sudden, inexplicable spiritual failure. It was a desperate, pragmatic necessity for survival.
It was. But the immense tension in the biblical text is that the final editor knows this historical reality. They know the Philistines were slaughtering the tribes. But the editor still judges the pivot to a monarchy as a profound theological failure. The text refuses to let pragmatic geopolitical necessity excuse a breach of covenant trust.
Survival at the cost of the covenant is viewed as worse than destruction.
That is the uncompromising nature of Deuteronomistic theology.
All right, we are moving now from these macro frameworks directly into the messy layered text of the chapters themselves. Let's start our chapter-by-chapter analysis and source criticism. And we have to start with chapters 8 through 10, because this is where the source critical problem is just glaringly obvious.
It's a dual account.
Exactly. We essentially have a dual account of Saul becoming king. Julius Wellhausen laid the foundation for this analysis back in the late 19th century. What did he see?
Wellhausen's observations in 1878 remain the bedrock for how we read these chapters. He pointed out that the text gives us two radically different interwoven perspectives on the exact same event. In the anti-monarchic strand, chapter 8 and parts of 10 asking for a king is framed as a grave sin, a rejection of Yahweh, and Samuel is furious.
Right.
But then, woven right into it, is a pro-monarchic strand found in chapter 9 and the early parts of 10. In this strand, there's no mention of the people's sinful demand. Instead, Yahweh sees the affliction of his people, takes pity on them, and actively orchestrates the meeting between Samuel and Saul. Saul is a divine gift. Samuel is happy to see him. There was absolutely no shadow of sin in this older strand.
P. Kyle McCarter mapped this out brilliantly in his Anchor Bible commentary. He identified that early pro-monarchic folkloric core, the story of the lost donkeys, which was later overlapped by the Deuteronomistic redaction. But the terminology itself shifts in a way that I find fascinating. When Samuel anoints Saul privately, Frank Moore Cross notes that he doesn't call him a melech, a king. He calls him a nagid.
The linguistic shift is crucial. Nagid translates roughly to prince, leader, or charismatic designate. It implies a military commander appointed by God for a specific crisis. Melech, on the other hand, is the standard ancient Near Eastern word for a full dynastic king, carrying all that bureaucratic baggage Samuel warns about. Cross argues the use of Nugget reflects a genuine historical memory of an early transitional institution in Israel. Okay, let me push back on that historical reading, though.
Yeah.
Is it possible that the title Nagid isn't a historical memory of a transitional office at all, but rather a semantic band-aid applied by the later editors?
How you mean?
Well, if the exilic editor believes that Yahweh is the only true Melech, maybe they just refuse to let God use that word for Saul. They have God call him a Nagid to soften the blow, essentially saying, well, God only appointed him as a temporary commander. It was the sinful people who later made him a Melech. Doesn't that protect God's reputation in the text? That is a very compelling counter-argument, and honestly, many scholars lean in that direction. The editors are highly motivated to maintain Yahweh's ultimate sovereignty. By having Yahweh designate Saul strictly as a Nagid, the text creates this massive distance between the divine will and the corrupt institution of the Melech.
Right.
However, we shouldn't view the final text as just a sloppy cut-and-paste job. Scholars like Anthony Campbell have argued for an intermediate prophetic record layer that deeply cared about the precise nature of these constitutional roles. And theologians like Walter Brueggemann insist that we must respect the final form of the text as a deliberate theological achievement.
How does Brueggemann view the tension, then?
For Brueggemann, the tension is the theology. The redactors weren't embarrassed by the contradiction, they intentionally preserved it to express a profound paradox. The monarchy was simultaneously a tragic human rebellion against God, and yet God chose to use it as a vehicle for divine deliverance. The text holds both realities at once.
And despite the later anti-monarchic framing, the text actually extends enormous theological generosity to Saul early on. In chapter 10, verse 9, it explicitly states that God gave Saul another heart. He wasn't set up as a villain from day one. He was genuinely equipped by the Spirit.
He had the tools to succeed.
Which makes the fall all the more tragic. But that brings us to chapter 13, the first rejection at Gilgal. John Bright reads this incident not just as a personal failure of patience by Saul, but as a massive constitutional conflict.
Bright's historical reconstruction is really essential here. In the broader ancient Near East Egypt, Babylon, Canaan kings routinely absorbed sacral functions. The king was often a priest or semi-divine. He controlled the cult and offered the primary state sacrifices to ensure victory in battle.
The king was the bridge to the gods.
Exactly. But Israelite theology, driven by the prophetic tradition, attempts this radical, unprecedented separation of powers. The king manages the state and the army, but the prophet fiercely guards access to the divine word and the sacral rites.
So when Saul sees his army melting away, and the seventh day is ending, his decision to offer the burnt offering himself is just standard ancient Near Eastern military pragmatism. Any other king in the region would have done it days earlier.
Right. But from the perspective of Samuel and the prophetic guild, Saul's pragmatic action is a hostile takeover of the sacred domain. He is crossing a hard constitutional boundary. He's trying to merge the state with the altar, and Samuel immediately shuts it down.
And the punishment Samuel hands down contains a detail that Lyle Essinger points out, which I find narratologically shocking. In verses 13 and 14, Samuel tells Saul his kingdom won't last, because the Lord hath sought him a man after his own heart. Essinger calls this a proleptic moment. David hasn't even been born in the narrative yet.
It's incredibly jarring for the reader, and think about how devastating it must have been for Saul. He's standing there, smelling the smoke of the sacrifice he just offered, having desperately tried to hold his terrified army together against a massive Philistine invasion. And the prophet instantly announces his replacement in the abstract.
The narrative is pointing entirely past Saul to a future king before Saul's reign has barely begun.
The ghost of David is haunting the text before he even enters it.
Okay, we need to explicitly signal a move into interpretive synthesis right now, because we're transitioning to chapter 15, the Amalekite episode. This chapter carries the heaviest moral and theological weight in the entire Samuel corpus. It is the story of the harem command, the command to completely annihilate a population.
It's a very difficult text for modern readers.
Extremely. There are three escalating moments of confrontation here. Saul's false, pious greeting to Samuel, the damning sound of the bleating sheep, and Saul's cowardly shifting of blame to his own troops. But beneath all that character drama is this horrifying divine command to commit total destruction. Let's look at Susan Niditch's work, specifically her 1993 book, War in the Hebrew Bible, to understand how the ancients processed this.
Niditch's work is vital here. She argues that we simply cannot read modern laws of armed conflict back into the text. In the ancient Israelite worldview, the harem, the band of total destruction, functioned essentially as a massive form of human and material sacrifice to Yahweh.
The logic being that the enemy belonged exclusively to God.
Exactly. Having been defeated in holy war, they were viewed as entirely consecrated to the deity.
So, to take the spoils of a harem war for oneself, as Saul and his men did, wasn't just insubordination, it was sacrilege.
It's viewed as stealing directly from God. It profanes the sacred. It operates on an ancient logic of holiness and contamination that is deeply disturbing to us today. But it possessed intense internal coherence for the ancient authors. It insisted that holy war could never be fought for economic profit.
Right. And we must impartially report how different schools of scholarship handle the historicity of an event like this. On one end, you have the minimalist view scholars like Thomas L. Thompson and Niels Peter Lemche from the Copenhagen School. They question the historicity of a united monarchy under Saul or David entirely, let alone a massive genocidal campaign deep in the Negev.
The minimalists look at the archaeological record and argue that 11th century Israel just lacked the state apparatus, the population density, and the logistics to project military force like that. For them, this battle never historically happened.
And if the event never happened historically, the moral problem shifts significantly. It moves from being a problem of a historical atrocity commanded by God to a problem of text ideology. What do you mean by text ideology?
Meaning, why did later post-exilic scribes invent a story about a commanded genocide? The minimalist argument is that the harem command here functions as a rhetorical device. The editors needed an impossibly absolute, terrifying standard of obedience to explain why Saul, the founding king, had to be violently rejected by God to make way for David. They used the ideology of total destruction as a narrative trap.
A trap that Saul was destined to fail. But if we read the text as we have it, prioritizing the narrative logic, Saul's decision to spare King Agag was highly deliberate. He wasn't just feeling merciful. He was performing kingship. He was acting like all the nations, validating Samuel's warning from chapter 8.
Precisely. Capturing a rival king alive, bringing him back in chains, and parading him before the people was the ultimate display of power for an ancient Near Eastern monarch. It proved you had arrived on the geopolitical stage. By sparing Agag, Saul is prioritizing his own status and political optics over his status as a subordinate covenant vassal to Yahweh. He's using holy war to build his own monument. The text even explicitly notes in verse 12 that Saul set up a monument for himself at Carmel.
And the text gets incredibly tense regarding God's emotional reaction to Saul's failure. We have the use of the Hebrew word nachem, which translates to divine repentance, regret, or sorrow. In verse 11, the text bluntly says that God regretted making Saul king. But this creates a massive philosophical problem. If God is omniscient and perfect, how can he regret an action? Abraham Heschel, in his 1962 masterpiece, The Prophets, gave us a profound way to understand this.
Heschel's concept of divine pathos really revolutionized how we read these texts. He argued forcefully against the Greek philosophical concept of divine immutability, the idea of an unmoving, unfeeling, static, unmoved mover. Heschel argued that the God of the Hebrew Bible is not a static absolute. He is a God of intense passion who is deeply dynamically affected by human history.
So when Yahweh says he regrets making Saul king, it's not a contradiction of his omniscience.
Not at all. It is an expression of genuine, agonizing relationship. God is genuinely wounded by Saul's failure. The divine pathos is real. God suffers with his creation.
Let's transition to chapter 16, the anointing of David. This chapter is the visual and structural reversal of everything we just witnessed with Saul. Robert Alter brilliantly analyzed the physical description of David when he is finally brought in from the fields. The narrator tells us David was ruddy and withal of a beautiful countenance and goodly to look to, which is a deeply ironic detail for the narrator to include, considering what God just told Samuel.
It's a brilliant piece of narrative irony. God explicitly commands Samuel to ignore physical appearance and height, asserting that the Lord looketh on the heart. But the moment David steps into the room, the narrator immediately gives us a glowing physical description of him. Alter points out that the text is doing two things here. First, it's setting up a visual contrast to Saul. Saul was defined by sheer size, a towering static monument. David is defined by a different kind of aesthetic. He's striking, vital, youthful, and intense.
What's the second thing the text is doing?
Alter notes the subtle danger in the narrator's choice. The text tells us not to value the exterior, yet immediately highlights David's exterior beauty. It subtly hints to the careful reader that while David's beauty sets him apart now, physical beauty and the desire it provokes will become a profound, destructive liability later in his life, specifically in the story of Bathsheba.
Oh, that's such a great read on it. This chapter is also the launchpad for what Leonard Ross, back in 1926, identified as the succession narrative, which is arguably the oldest sustained historical narrative in the ancient world. And what an incredible introduction it is. David gets the spirit, and Saul loses it. And there is a dark, sophisticated irony at the end of chapter 16 that I find absolutely chilling. Saul is being tormented by an evil spirit. His servants suggest finding a skilled musician. One servant recommends a young man who is cunning in playing, a mighty valiant man, prudent in matters, and crucially, the Lord is with him. It's David.
It is a masterful piece of narrative art. The man who has secretly taken Saul's crown is brought into Saul's most intimate private chambers to soothe his madness. The successor is physically tending to the shell of the man he is actively replacing.
Saul loves David greatly and makes him his armor bearer, entirely ignorant of the fact that this boy is the neighbor better than thou who has inherited his kingdom. The reader knows everything, Saul knows nothing.
It's tragic irony at its finest.
We have mapped out the sources and the chapter progression. Now we are moving into section 4. Exegetical and theological exploration, where we synthesize the overarching theological claims the text is making. We'll start with the theology of divine kingship. Moshe Weinfeld heavily contrasted the laws concerning the king in Deuteronomy 17 with the warnings about the king in 1 Samuel 8. The core question is the monarchy simply a divine concession to a rebellious people, or is it an apostasy that God somehow uniquely redeems through the Davidic covenant later on?
That's the crux of the entire theological tension. In Deuteronomy 17, the law provides a constitutional framework for a king, but it heavily restricts him. He's forbidden to multiply horses for a mass of cavalry, forbidden to multiply wives for foreign alliances, forbidden to multiply gold and silver. It outlines a constitutionally defamed king who relies entirely on Yahweh. But in 1 Samuel 8, the request for a king is framed not as fulfilling Deuteronomy, but as outright treason.
How does Walter Brueggemann reconcile that tension?
Brueggemann focuses on the theology of God's respect for human agency. Yahweh permits the monarchy, deeply respecting Israel's tragic, autonomous choice to reject him. But God does not abandon them to that choice. Instead, God works within that compromised rebellious structure. God ultimately redeems the apostasy of the monarchy by establishing the Davidic covenant in 2 Samuel 7, essentially bringing this rebellious institution back under divine management.
And that brings us back to that famous phrase from chapter 13, a man after his own heart. Robert Alter makes a brilliant observation about the ambiguity of the Hebrew phrase here, ish kilbabo. Does it mean a man whose heart is perfectly aligned with Yahweh's moral will? Or does it mean a man who simply has the heart of the people, a man whom the people will naturally love?
Alter's linguistic point is vital for seeing the political realism of the text. Contextually, David is exactly what God wants for the people as a leader and what the people intuitively want in a king. David possesses a natural charisma, a political genius, and an emotional intelligence that Saul utterly lacks. David knows how to capture the heart of Israel. He is man after God's heart, but he also becomes the heart of the nation.
We also need to explicitly clarify the theology of the Spirit in these texts. When Samuel anoints David, the Ruha Yahweh, the Spirit of the Lord, rushes upon David. Simultaneously, it departs from Saul, and a Ruha Hara, an evil spirit from the Lord, falls upon him. We have to be very careful not to read our modern theology back into this, right? Ancient Israelite readers did not have a modern dualistic theology where God and a cosmic Satan are fighting equal battles for human souls.
That is a critical distinction. In the worldview of early Iron Age Israelite theology, Yahweh is absolutely sovereign over all spirits, both benevolent and malevolent. There is no independent realm of evil operating outside of God's ultimate jurisdiction. So an evil spirit from Yahweh does not mean a demon from hell in the New Testament sense. It means a spirit of torment, melancholy, paranoia, or madness that God permits, or even dispatches, as an active agent of judgment.
So the withdrawal of the Ruach Yahweh is the withdrawal of royal empowerment and divine sanction. And the sending of the Ruach Ra is the active psychological dismantling of Saul's stability. God is dismantling the monument from the inside. Let's explicitly break down the major scholarly debates happening beneath the surface here so our listener has the complete landscape. First, the pro versus anti-monarchy debate. We mentioned Wellhausen, who argued the anti-monarchic material was a late exilic addition. But Gerhard von Rad, writing between 1957 and 1960, pushed back hard against that, arguing it was a genuine ancient prophetic debate. And Richard Nelson later refined it, arguing for proto-Deuteronomistic concerns.
Yes, von Rad effectively dismantled the idea that resistance to kingship was just a late exilic afterthought. He argued that intense anti-monarchic sentiment was deeply embedded in older northern prophetic circles, like the traditions of Hosea, long before the exile. These northern prophets hated the centralization of power in Jerusalem. Nelson takes this further, suggesting that the Deuteronomistic editors who compiled this material during the exile already had access to deep-seated, historically early anti-monarchic traditions. It was a live, burning political debate in Israel from the very moment Saul was crowned.
The second massive debate is the historicity of Saul. This is the battleground of biblical archaeology. We have Israel Finkelstein and Neil Asher Silberman driving the maximalist-minimalist debate. They view the early united monarchy under Saul and David as largely a literary construct, a golden age myth. But William Dever pushes back from the maximalist side, saying the sheer literary roughness of the text points to authentic historical memory. And then we have the evidence, or lack thereof, from the Tel-Dan stele.
Finkelstein and Soberman argue from the settlement patterns that 11th century Judah and Benjamin were simply too sparsely populated to support the kind of massive centralized kingdom described in 1 Samuel. They view Saul as a shadowy local tribal chieftain at best, but Dever argues that the literary texture for Samuel argues against pure mythological invention.
Because it's just too messy.
Exactly. If you were a later scribe making up a founding national myth from scratch, you wouldn't make it this embarrassing. You wouldn't include the bizarre contradictions, the brutal realism of Saul's psychological collapse, or his absolute failure to establish a dynasty. As for the Tel-Dan stele, an Aramean inscription from the 9th century BCE that famously mentions the House of David, it's completely silent on Saul. But maximalists argue that simply reflects the fact that the later Arameans only cared about the dynasty that actually survived and rivaled them, which was David's.
The third major debate revolves around Saul's guilt. How culpable is he really? James Kugel reads Saul essentially as a tragic scapegoat, a man set up by the text and by God to fail. But Walter Brueggemann reads Saul differently, as a figure who is crushed by the demand of the unconditional.
Kugel leans heavily into the impossibility of Saul's position. He notes that Samuel is incredibly elusive, giving Saul contradictory commands, setting a psychological trap with the 7-day wait at Gilgal, and then punishing him with absolute finality for a minor infraction. But Brueggemann looks at it through the lens of faith versus statecraft. Brueggemann argues that Saul operates purely in the realm of the conditional. He calculates military odds, he manages troop morale, he makes alliances, he's a politician. But Yahweh, speaking through Samuel, demands the unconditional. Yahweh demands holy war, exact obedience, and absolute reliance on divine intervention, regardless of the military optics.
So I have to ask you, if Brueggemann is right that Saul is destroyed because he cannot meet the demand of the unconditional, does the text suggest that practical wisdom, pragmatism, what Aristotle would call phronesis, is actually an enemy of faith?
In the specific terrifying context of holy war and explicit prophetic command, the text seems to be saying exactly that. The narrative makes a radical, unsettling claim that when God speaks an absolute command, human calculation, no matter how rational, prudent, or necessary it seems for survival, becomes a form of rebellion. Saul's profound tragedy is that he was a very good general and a rational politician, but he was a terrible prophetic subordinate. He couldn't stop calculating.
Wow. And what about Samuel's complexity in all of this? Ralph Klein points out the prophet's deep emotional investments, his ongoing grief, and the highly ambiguous, almost sabotaging constraints he placed on Saul. Samuel is not a neutral umpire calling balls and strikes here. Klein is absolutely right to highlight the prophet's psychology. Samuel is a deeply conflicted, almost tragic figure himself. He was personally insulted by the people's request for a king. He felt replaced. He was forced by God to anoint a man he didn't want to anoint. And he seems to harbor a latent hostility towards Saul from the very beginning. Yet, when God officially rejects Saul, Samuel does not gloat. The text says Samuel cried out to God all night in angry distress. He is torn between his love for his people, his bruised personal ego, and his terrifying obedience to a God who demands total loyalty. Let's shift our focus now from history and theology to the sheer narrative artistry of the text. This is Section 5, Literary and Character Analysis. Robert Alter's techniques are on full display in these chapters, specifically his concept of narration through dialogue. Look how the rejection speeches expand. In chapter 13 at Gilgal, Samuel's rejection is brief, almost procedural. But by chapter 15 over the Amalekites, the dialogue expands into this massive poetic condemnation. The expanding dialogue maps the expanding weight of the sin.
Alter's brilliant insight into biblical narrative is that the narrator rarely tells us what a character is thinking. Instead, characters reveal their inner moral state through how they speak. In chapter 15, Saul uses incredibly slippery, manipulative language. He greets Samuel with religious enthusiasm, but the moment Samuel mentions the bleating sheep, Saul instantly shifts to the plural. They have brought them from the Amalekites, for the people spared the best. Always passing the buck, always. He uses religious language to cloak his disobedience. Samuel's response, by contrast, is highly structured, poetic, and absolute. Samuel crushes Saul's verbal evasions under the rhythmic weight of theological truth.
Alter also highlights the profound ambiguity of the torn robe in chapter 15. Saul grabs the hem of Samuel's robe and it tears. The question is, did Samuel tear it intentionally as a prophetic, dramatic sign? Or did Saul tear it accidentally in his desperate, clumsy attempt to hold on to the prophet? The passive Hebrew distributes the responsibility. Text just says, and it tore.
It is a masterstroke of ambiguity. The tearing of the physical fabric mirrors the tearing of the kingdom, and it is left passive because both men are caught in the tearing. Saul's desperation causes it, but Samuel immediately weaponizes it as a divine oracle. The Lord hath rent the kingdom of Israel from thee this day.
Let's do a comparative character study of Saul and David, specifically looking at how they handle their ultimate failures. If we analyze Saul's confession in 15.30, after Samuel finally backs him into a corner, Saul says, I have sinned, yet honor me now, I pray thee, before the elders of my people. Contrast that with David's naked confession in 2 Samuel 12, when the prophet Nathan confronts him over Bathsheba and the murder of Uriah.
This comparison is the defining character difference between the two monarchs. When Samuel relentlessly breaks Saul down, Saul finally admits, I have sinned, but his immediate reflexive next breath is, yet honor me now before the elders. Saul is utterly consumed with his public image, his optics, his standing before the elite class. His repentance is transactional. And when Nathan confronts David with a sin that is arguably much worse morally, adultery and premeditated murder, David simply says, I have sinned against the Lord. Full stop. There are no caveats. There is no plea for public relations management. David is willing to be completely broken and humiliated before God. Saul is only willing to bend if he can still look tall to the people.
We also see the narrative use of a leetwort, a recurring leading word that acts as a thematic anchor. In chapter 15, it is the Hebrew word shama, meaning to hear, to listen, or to obey. The entire conflict is a contested claim over who actually listened.
Yes. The word shamaz is repeated obsessively. Samuel tells Saul to shama the words of the Lord. Saul claims he did shama the voice of the Lord. Samuel counters by asking why Saul did not shama the voice of the Lord. And finally, Samuel declares that God delights in those who shama his voice, because to shama is better than sacrifice. The relentless repetition of the word hammers home the central Deuteronomistic theme. True hearing is absolute obedience. You have not heard God until you have obeyed God.
In terms of narrative management, Mir Sternberg's 1985 work, The Poetics of Biblical Narrative, is crucial here. He talks about the omniscient narrator's selective disclosure and what he calls the reliability gap. In chapter 16, the narrator tells us that God looks on David's heart. We are assured that David has the right heart, but the narrator deliberately refuses to show us what is actually in that heart. We get no access to David's inner thoughts.
Sternberg argues that the biblical narrator exercises supreme strategic control over what the reader is allowed to know. By telling us God sees David's heart, but withholding the actual psychological contents of that heart from the reader, the narrator forces us into a position of dependence. We are told David is the righteous choice, but we aren't given the data to prove it yet.
It's like a blind trust exercise. Think about modern suspense films where the director shows you a character entering a dark room, but doesn't show you what's in the room. The text forces the reader to trust Yahweh's judgment without providing the evidence to back it up yet. We just have to watch the rest of the books of Samuel play out to see if God was ultimately right.
And structurally, the narrative management here is beautiful. There's a perfect symmetry to these chapters. Saul is installed in chapters 9 and 10. He is rejected conditionally in chapter 13. He's given one more chance in chapter 14, but messes that up. He's rejected finally and absolutely in chapter 15. And David is installed in chapter 16. It is a perfect chiastic structure, a narrative V-shape.
Saul walks down the stairs of his ruin, and in the exact reverse order, David walks up the stairs to power.
The structure itself embodies the theology. The architecture of the chapters reflects the providential, inescapable replacement occurring in the history.
We are moving into section 6 now, rabbinic and Christian interpretive traditions. It is endlessly fascinating to explore how 2 millennia of intense religious thought have navigated the historical and theological landmines in this text. Let's start with the rabbinic interpretation. In the Talmud, specifically Tractate Sanhedrin 20b, and in Rashi's classic medieval commentary, they tackle the profound problem of the people's demand for a king. They argue the demand for a monarchy wasn't actually the sin, the specific motivation was.
For the rabbis, the Torah is the ultimate authority. And Deuteronomy 17 clearly contains a commandment to appoint a king once Israel enters the land. So logically, the sin in 1 Samuel 8 couldn't be the institution of the monarchy itself. The rabbis, and Rashi in particular, point out the specific phrasing, "Make us a king to judge us like all the nations." Rashi argues that they didn't ask for a king to enforce the Torah or to guide them in holiness. They asked for a king for aesthetic and military reasons. They wanted a king to make them look respectable to the surrounding Canaanite and Philistine empires.
So it's a profound aesthetic betrayal. They are looking across the border at the glittering, centralized city-states and feeling a sense of embarrassment about their own decentralized, invisible God.
That is the core of the rabbinic critique. It was a political betrayal rooted in spiritual insecurity.
And what about the Amalekites? How does a continuous living religious tradition handle an explicit divine command for genocide? Maimonides, the great medieval philosopher, noted that the commandment to wipe out Amalek became historically unenforceable after the Assyrian king Sennacherib conquered the region and mixed up all the nations. You literally couldn't identify an Amalekite anymore. But the Hasidic tradition, particularly the Baal Shem Tov, took it a step further and allegorized Amalek. They equated Amalek with the Yetzer Hara, the evil impulse within the human heart.
This is a profound, necessary spiritual pivot. The Hasidic masters recognized the moral horror of a literal application of the Harem command. So they internalized the conflict. Amalek attacked Israel from behind, targeting the weak and the weary in the wilderness. The Hasidic tradition says that Amalek represents the doubt, the cynicism, the base desires, and the spiritual lethargy that attack a person when they are exhausted. Therefore, the command to show no mercy to Amalek becomes an internal psychological command. You must completely eradicate the cynicism in your own soul.
That is a beautiful internalization. But the Talmud in Tractate Megillah maintains a terrifying historical consequence for Saul's specific failure. It links Haman, the villain from the Book of Esther, who is explicitly called an Agagite, directly back to Saul's failure to kill King Agag in 1 Samuel 15. And Mordecai, the hero of Esther, is explicitly introduced as a descendant of Kish, Saul's father.
The rabbinic mind sees the timeline of history as a single, tightly connected moral tapestry. Saul sparing Agag is not viewed as a moment of progressive compassion. It is viewed as a catastrophic dereliction of duty. His misplaced mercy allowed the seed of Amalek to survive, endangering his descendants centuries later. Mordecai finally finishes the holy war that his ancestor Saul failed to complete.
The Talmud in Yoma 22b offers a radically candid, almost shocking comparison of Saul and David's sins. It points out that Saul only committed one sin sparing the Amalekites and lost his entire kingdom, while David committed two massive, horrific sins: adultery with Bathsheba and the murder of Uriah, and yet kept his throne and his dynasty. The rabbis note the difference between Saul's public humiliation and David's private cover-up.
Yoma 22b wrestles deeply with the apparent unfairness of God's judgment here. Why is Saul destroyed for military infraction while David survives murder? The rabbis suggest several reasons. First, David's repentance, once finally confronted by Nathan, was total, absolute, and unmitigated, whereas Saul continuously deflected blame. Furthermore, Saul's sin was a public, national failure that compromised the entire nation in the context of holy war. David's sins, horrific and bloody as they were personal moral failures that did not directly defy a prophetic military mandate regarding the nation's geopolitical standing.
Leviticus Rabbah 26 also comments on this narrative, highlighting God's direct epistemology versus human inferential judgment, emphasizing that only God sees the root of the heart, which justifies the rejection of Eliab. Now let's look at the Christian interpretation of these texts. We have the long tradition of typology. The Apostle Paul, in Acts chapter 13, verse 22, uses this exact text as messianic prefiguration. He quotes God saying, "I have found David the son of Jesse, a man after mine own heart, which shall fulfill all my will," directly linking David's kingship to the ultimate kingship of Jesus. And later, during the Reformation, Martin Luther and John Calvin latched onto Samuel's speech in chapter 15, "To obey is better than sacrifice," interpreting it as the ultimate critique of works righteousness.
In Christian typology, David serves as the ultimate historical type, or foreshadowing, of Christ. He is the shepherd who becomes a king, anointed by the Spirit, ruling righteously. For the Protestant reformers like Luther, Saul became the negative archetype. Saul became the archetype of the legalist, the Pharisee. Saul performs the outward ritual, he offers the sacrifice, he builds the altar, but he completely lacks the inward faith and obedience. This contrast mapped perfectly onto the Protestant theological distinction between salvation by grace through faith and the dead works of the law.
We see a split in modern Christian interpretation. Christopher Seitz represents a mainline canonical approach, cautioning against supersessionism. He argues we can't just read the Old Testament as Judaism failed, Christianity won, using Saul as a prop. But John Woodhouse represents a very different evangelical approach. He prioritizes the final form canonical text over any historical critical dissection, focusing heavily on its immediate preaching value for today, seeing David as the clear lens for understanding Christ.
They are two very different ways of honoring the text as Scripture.
But I have to push back on this entire tradition. Is the Christian typological reading inherently unfair to Saul? When we use him just to highlight David or to highlight Jesus, do we reduce a complex, grieving, terrified human being into a mere theological stepping stone? Doesn't it strip him of his humanity?
That is the perpetual inherent danger of typological reading. When a historical figure becomes merely a symbol for the old law or a symbol for the flesh or an archetype of failure, you flatten them. You strip them of their complex humanity. Saul was a real man who suffered immensely, who felt abandoned by God and who watched his mind slowly disintegrate. A responsible, ethical reading of Scripture, even a devoutly Christian one, has to hold space for the tragic, messy humanity of Saul. We have to recognize that he was a man crushed under a prophetic and historical burden he was simply never fully equipped to carry.
We have reached our final section. And I want to explicitly signal a shift in register here. We are moving from the analytical, the historical critical, and the academic debates into a warmer, more personal, and transformative reading of the text. This is our outro, the LDS devotional reading. And to do this, we have to go back to 1 Samuel 16.7. The Lord seeth not as man seeth, for man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looketh on the heart.
This single verse is the absolute linchpin for Latter-day Saint devotional engagement with the Samuel narrative. It highlights the profound inadequacy of external markers for determining covenant fitness. We live in a modern world that is completely obsessed with the outward appearance resumes, aesthetics, social media status, public perception. Saul was the ancient equivalent of the perfect resume. He was tall, handsome, wealthy, and commanded the room. He looked like leadership. David was the kid who wasn't even invited to the interview. He was left out in the sheep fields.
This connects directly and beautifully to the fifth article of faith. We believe that a man must be called of God, by prophecy and by the laying on of hands. In the biblical narrative, neither Saul nor David put themselves forward. They didn't run a campaign. They were called by prophecy. Elder Christoph G. Road Carrier, in the October 2023 General Conference, taught that the gospel of Jesus Christ acts as a corrective lens to the distortions of mortality, status, and appearance.
Elder Gerard Carrier's profound point is perfectly illustrated by the prophet Samuel standing in Jesse's house. Samuel is a prophet of God, arguably the greatest since Moses, and yet even he was still looking through the distorted lens of mortality when he saw Eliab, Jesse's oldest son. He saw the height and thought, this is the guy. He had to be actively corrected by revelation. The devotional takeaway for us is that we all suffer from this mortal myopia. We misjudge others, and tragically, we often misjudge ourselves based entirely on superficial external metrics. The gospel invites us to borrow God's vision, to look at the heart to see the potential that the world's metrics completely miss.
And within the Latter-day Saint tradition, we have an incredibly rich textual dialogue with this material through the Book of Mormon. Research from the Neil A. Maxwell Institute and BYU Studies has highlighted the deep, intentional structural parallels between 1 Samuel 8 and Mosiah chapter 29. King Mosiah's rejection of the monarchy perfectly mirrors and even amplifies Samuel's mishpat Amalek, the warning about the king.
The parallel is stunning when you read them side by side. King Mosiah, at the end of his life, steps down and institutes a system of judges. He explicitly warns his people that an unrighteous king will destroy them. He enacts laws that parallel Samuel's warnings about confiscation, unrighteous dominion, and the loss of liberty. The Book of Mormon text is in deep, sophisticated theological dialogue with the Deuteronomistic critique of kingship. Both texts reach the exact same conclusion. Centralized, absolute monarchic power is incredibly dangerous for a covenant people because it inevitably shifts their ultimate reliance from Yahweh to an arm of flesh.
If we look at institutional application, Samuel's anguished cry that to obey is better than sacrifice is a vital restoration principle. It serves as a permanent warning against institutional apostasy. It is entirely possible for us today to retain all the outward forms of a covenant, the beautiful buildings, the exact rituals, the meetings, the sacrifices of time and money, while completely losing the inner alignment with God's actual will. That is exactly what happened to Saul, and it is the perpetual danger for any religious institution, including our own.
That is precisely right. The restoration itself, as articulated in Joseph Smith's first vision, was predicated on the divine diagnosis that the religious world had a form of godliness, but they deny the power thereof. Saul is the tragic living embodiment of that verse. He had the form of godliness. He built altars at Gilgal. He offered burnt offerings. He fought holy wars. But he denied the power of God by substituting his own pragmatic will and his own timeline for the explicit divine command.
Which brings us back, finally, to the pathos of God. Let's return to Heschel one last time. As we read this devotionally, I want to emphasize the grief of God and the grief of Samuel over Saul. When we read the story in Sunday school, we shouldn't read it as a triumphant, clean victory for David. It is a genuine divine loss. God weeps for the hollowed out man.
Recognizing that grief changes how we view divine judgment entirely. God does not discard Saul callously or vindictively. The physical tearing of the kingdom from Saul is accompanied by the emotional tearing of the divine heart. The God we worship is a being of profound emotional depth. He's deeply invested in our successes, and he is shattered by our failures.
And that brings me to our final provocative thought for you, the listener, as we wrap up this deep dive. We are constantly told in church lessons that we need to learn to look on the heart of others, to see past the outward appearance. But I want to flip that application entirely. What happens when the Lord looks on your heart? What happens when God bypasses your resume, bypasses your perceived inadequacy, and asks you to step out from among the baggage? When God calls you into the terrifying space of his unconditional demand, are you hiding among the stuff because you are genuinely humble? Or are you resisting because, like Saul, you are terrified of losing control, terrified of the unconditional demand of faith? Next time, the narrative accelerates as David steps out of the obscurity of the sheep fields and onto the blood-soaked soil of the battlefield. We'll see you then.